Hello, it's good to see you again. Welcome back to Thinking Out Loud. And one of the things I love to do is sit by a fire. This is lovely, isn't it? This is a gas fire, but for many years our house in England was heated by a coal fire, and I'd sit beside the fire and watch the flames. Sometimes I'd watch the flames dance and make shadows. And sometimes I'd just sit there and watch the fire eat the chunks of coal. I'd dream, and sometimes I'd remember people, or listen to music and read a good book. Today I'm remembering a good friend from long ago who worked in a coal mine, and his life affected a lot of people. Come on, let me tell you what I think. Coal fires are lovely, aren't they? But they do make a mess. This way of doing things is so much easier. When we lived in England, we would mostly burn coal that came from mines not far from where we lived. My friend Dave was a miner. Well, he was an electrician that worked at a coal mine, but anybody who worked there was a miner to outsiders. Today we're going to have to visit the model railway again. And today we'll be looking for my friend Dave. One of the newest parts of the layout is this area here, and the unusually small section has created some interesting challenges. At this end there's a canal, and long ago coal was moved by barges on the canals in England. Although this is supposed to be Kent, so no canals were really there. But I like canals and canal boats, so I'm going to do it anyway. The long building at the back there has a roof made out of a chocolate box. We had fun eating those before I recycled the box and made it into the roof there. It looks like there's been an accident. There's an ambulance on the way and there's a fire engine already there. Let me tell you the story. There's several important parts to this story. One of them that will help you understand what happened is to do with an electronic thing called a capacitor. I have several here. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and these are just smaller ones, but they'll do the job today. So what does it do? Well, a capacitor is really two parallel pieces of metal rolled up that don't touch, and somehow they hold an electrical charge. We won't go into how they do, but they do. One of the things about the capacitor is that it's able to discharge that electrical charge really quickly. And if you look really carefully, you might see a spark as I do that. You want to see again? Sometimes really long cables hold a charge just like a capacitor. That's because the parallel conductors can look to electricity very much like a capacitor. Cables are usually made in a clever way to avoid that, but there's always a little bit of capacitance on especially long cables. Before working on them, it's important to discharge the electrical charge on the cable so that you don't get a nasty surprise when you touch the connectors. This particular coal mine was part of the Kent coalfield, and that's in the southeast of England. The distance from the surface to the coalface was several miles, and so the long cables going down there to the coalface that powered the machines acted as large capacitors. The mines were rough and tough, and the men who worked there were rough and tough too. And when I was at school, I lived in this area, and one of the few jobs that was open to most of us as schoolboys was to work down the mines. In fact, work experience days from school would send us to these coal mines, and we would go down and have a look and see how it all worked. It was fascinating. Many of the boys would know some of the men at the mine, and some had fathers or older brothers that were already working there. They'd, "Hey Dad," as they went down. I must say I have some wonderful memories of seeing the coalface deep underground. Some of the mines went right out under the English Channel. The coal moved around down there on conveyor belts and then on little trains, and it was a fantastic system. All that work to get coal up so that I could burn it at home. Some areas of the mine were really hot, and others were really cool and wet. And as you went around, you'd hear the enormous fans and pumps running that kept the water out and the fresh air in. Once the coal got to the surface, most mines had trains that took it to where it was needed. In Kent, that was a local power station called Richborough. But some of the coal was moved on a clever system of buckets, and the buckets went overhead like a cable car and ran for several miles and then into a tunnel and out through the White Cliffs of Dover. It's amazing the White Cliffs stayed white with all of that coal dust blowing around. The mines were fascinating to me, but I'm really, really glad I didn't ever have to work there. Those working conditions were harsh. I have really a great deal of respect for the men that did that kind of work and did it day after day to provide for their families. Let me tell you a little bit about Dave. Dave wasn't at all like the other miners there. He was big. Well, he seemed big to me, but then I was small at the time. And he was older, but again, I was younger too. But Dave stands out because of his character, not just because of his size. Unlike the brash miners, Dave was different. Whenever he saw me, he would smile and find a way of encouraging me in whatever it was I was doing. He would ask me questions and show interest and try and teach me something, but gently. When I started studying electronics and electrical engineering, he could have shown me how much he knew, and he knew a lot. But instead, he listened and he encouraged. He had a way of making complicated things easy to understand, and that's something I've tried to learn from my friend Dave. It's one of the things that it was really impressive, the way he did that. And one of my favorite Bible chapters has something to say about Dave. Let me show you what I mean. Philippians chapter 2 says, "Is there any encouragement for belonging to Christ? Any comfort from his love? Any fellowship together in the Spirit? Are your hearts tender and compassionate? Then make me truly happy by agreeing wholeheartedly with each other, loving one another, working together with one mind and purpose. Don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourself. Don't look out only for your own interests, but take an interest in others too. You must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had." There's a lot to see in this short passage, isn't there? And that last part, you must have the same attitude as Christ Jesus, is a really challenging part, isn't it? Almost 40 years ago, I memorized this part of the Bible, and it's still a favorite and stuck firmly in my head. So now it's there. I can think of it when I'm doing other things. Well, let's get back to our story. One day at the mine, the machines underground came to a halt and something had broken, and Dave was called. And Dave, you need to get this thing fixed. First he got on the phone with the other engineers and he asked a whole bunch of questions. I can imagine his soft manner as he quizzed the underground engineers. I expect they were using all kinds of words that aren't good, and they were getting excited because they were going to lose their bonus of getting tons of extra coal out of the ground that was now stuck until he had finished. Dave would say things like, "I'm sure you're right, but can you check this and can you check that? And can you do this before I come down? It will save time in the long run." And he had such a gentle manner, and he would patiently gather all the information he needed before making the long journey underground. Eventually, Dave shut off the power using a huge mechanism at the top of the pit, and then off he went down. Now, it was going to take a long time. First of all, he had to get in the cage and ride the cage down to the bottom of the shaft, and it was a really deep mine. And then, once he was down at the bottom, he had to get on a train and ride all the way out to the coalface. And it took well over half an hour to get from the top to the face. And once there, Dave was very careful and methodical, and he was always very safety conscious. And he would carefully take off all of the safety covers and then measure the voltage on the terminals And as he expected, there'd be quite a high voltage left there from the capacitive charge. That'll be the charge, I could hear him thinking. Extra ventilation had already been turned on, and blast doors even had been closed, because sparks in a mine are really dangerous, and they would have checked for methane gas and so on as well. When all the checks and the safety procedures had been made, Dave set about discharging the capacitive charge on the cables, and he did it by getting hold of one of these. It's a file, and what he was going to do was put it across the terminals to discharge that charge. Now there was going to be a big spark, which is why all of those safety procedures had been put in place. But unfortunately the power mechanism at the top had broken, and as he put the file across the terminals, the power was still there. And so the file melted, and the hot molten metal flew back at his hands and face and took all his skin off. He was really badly burned. Dave's character was about to be revealed for all to see. And the group of men standing around all knew how gentle and compassionate Dave normally was. But a few things to go along with ouch could be forgiven in this kind of situation. But that simply didn't come out of Dave, because that wasn't in there. The very first thing that came out of Dave's mouth was, "Is anyone hurt? Is everyone okay?" Dave was concerned about the other men despite his horrible injuries. "Make sure everyone's okay," he kept saying. "Make sure everyone's okay." And this is all the time they're trying to get him on a stretcher and get him out of the mine. Now, Dave was going to be taken off to hospital, and it would be a long time before he'd get there. He's got that whole journey back up to the surface to do first. But Dave all the time was considering others as more important than himself, despite how badly injured he was. It was an extreme situation, and why would it be any different? Why would he react in a different way? The real Dave shone brighter than it had every other day, but it was just him. Can you see how verse 3 describes Dave so very well? Don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourself. Dave spent a long time in hospital, and amazingly his skin all grew back. In fact, he looked much younger than he had before with all this new baby skin. He had a few scars, but really recovered very well. Not many years later, the mine closed down and Dave retired. And I expect the men that were there that day could tell this story long after Dave was better, just as I am. And of course, they remembered how Dave was concerned for them rather than himself when he was so badly injured. Long after, Dave and I talked about this accident, and he said, "Oh, Ian, I'm so glad it was me and not the others that got hurt that day. It would have been horrible for them." And I couldn't help thinking, I don't think I would have been thinking that way. But that was Dave. Quite a character. Dave didn't just follow Jesus and his way of doing things. He represented Jesus very well, didn't he? How about you? When things go wrong for you, how do you react? Does the way you react in extreme situations change from the way you live day to day? Do you think of others as better than yourself? And that's hard, isn't it? I still remember Dave encouraging me as a young electronic engineer decades after we last met. Do you go out of your way to encourage people? There's a lot we can learn from Dave's accident, isn't there? We'll visit the railway again one day, I'm sure. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Thinking Out Loud and hearing about my friend Dave and his character. If you have, please let me know. If you haven't already done so, click that subscribe button and then the bell icon thingy, and then you'll hear when the next video comes along. You'll be the first to know. Oh, tell your friends. Until next time, goodbye.